Hello, I'm Milan Ślewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Now, this time around, we're talking about the one and only Vladimir Putin, the bloated tyrant from the Kremlin. Now, if there is one thing we have learned from history, is that appeasing leaders with a penchant for acquiring real estate by force tends to backfire. Yet, here we are, watching Western leaders try to figure out how much they can help Ukraine without ruffling the feathers of Russia's double-headed eagle. Like a clingy ex who refuses to give back your favorite sweatshirt, Putin isn't interested in a cordial handshake and some small talk at the next G20 summit. While some voices in the West are fine with letting Putin have a bit of land so they can go back to their own issues, there is a strong argument that bending over for the Kremlin leads to a nasty crick in your democratic backbone. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report on what Russia might want out of potential negotiations to end the war in Ukraine.
The war in Ukraine has dragged on for far too long in the eyes of increasingly many people who have stakes in it. With the Trump administration ready to go, the idea of peace negotiations has become more tangible than ever, especially given how the new president has been confident in his ability to resolve the conflict. Yet any peace talks would only succeed if both sides, at least to a degree, get what they want, as neither has been sorely beaten.
We are ready to discuss security guarantees for the same side, which is now called Ukraine, or a part of this country that has not yet determined itself in any way, unlike Crimea, Donbass and Novorossiya.
These words said by the Russian foreign minister, and especially that last name, are very typical of Russia's propaganda narratives concerning Ukraine. Though his statement does show that Russia wants some sort of guarantee that Ukraine will not become a threat to its interests. Despite holding a fifth of Ukraine, however, Russia's position isn't as strong as it would like. This is mainly because of the Ukrainian breach into Russia's Kursk region. Both Moscow and its satellite state ally Minsk believe this move by Ukraine was a way to improve its position in talks.
I agree with Putin when he said that there is a struggle to raise the stakes, that they want, if there are negotiations, to win a stronger position.
The Ukrainians, meanwhile, aren't fully convinced that their partners in the West fully understand how Russia will approach these negotiations.
The Russian Federation never negotiates over what it considers to be its legal property. Never. That's why there were never negotiations about Crimea.
Many hope that this new year will bring an end to the war, but that depends on all sides finally coming to the table.
And now, as always, it's time to delve deeper into the issue at hand. So, let's begin. The truth is, handing Putin even the smallest win in Ukraine sets the stage for every unscrupulous leader around the globe to start demanding their own freebies. Why wage a fair fight when you can just push boundaries until someone forks over a consolation prize? That's like giving a toddler a cookie to stop screaming in the grocery aisle, except the toddler is a nuclear-armed autocrat. If we cave to that logic once, we'll be stuck in a perpetual loop of feed the tantrum, forcing us to watch as authoritarian regimes line up at the buffet of Western concessions. Now, you might say, but come on, we've got sanctions, we've got condemnations. How could we possibly be letting Putin off so easily? And that would be an excellent point. The trouble is that while sanctions are tightening economic news here and there, illusions of potential breakthroughs or half-baked peace deals loom large on the horizon. And if those so-called peace deals include giving Russia the chunk of land it's forcibly sitting on, well, that's akin to awarding the toddler the entire cookie factory. It doesn't solve the tantrum problem, it encourages more screaming in the future. Look, I get it, Western policymakers are dealing with an energy crunch, inflation, supply chain woes, and a general global meltdown. The idea of, hey, let's just be done with this messy war and move on, certainly has a superficial appeal. Except, letting an aggressive authoritarian regime walk away with a trophy for its violent escapades is an even bigger mess, one that might eventually plop its problems on your doorstep. Today, it's Ukraine. Tomorrow, it could be a NATO member. Then, we're all in the deep end, clutching inflatable pool noodles for dear life. Consider this. every time an international crisis emerges, the global community holds its breath, waiting to see whether the West and its allies stand for their principles or they bail at the first sign of adversity. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a high-stakes test of that very principle. If we blink, we teach Putin and the world that all it takes is a little aggression, some energy blackmail, and a stern glare to force democratic nations to cave in. We basically put a for sale sign on the concept of sovereignty. And no, just because the war has gone on for far too long isn't a reason to press the fast-forward button on a moral imperative. Yes, the war is brutal, tragic, and we want it to end. Nobody's cheering for an indefinite conflict. But the question is this: how does it end? And are we aiming for a resolution that respects Ukraine's sovereignty, or are we just slapping a band-aid on a bullet wound and hoping no one notices the gaping hole underneath? In short, if you ask me, we shouldn't give Putin his endgame. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Sergei Yerofeyev, sociologist from Rutgers University, and Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer from University College London. Hello, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hi, Janusz.
Hello.
So let's begin by asking a fundamental question. Sergei Yerofeyev, do you think that Russia is in fact willing to negotiate at this stage, or is Putin simply trying to buy time?
Well, first of all, I would like to distinguish the two concepts, Russia and Putin. This is not of Russia's willing, whatever is happening on the political arena by the hands of Vladimir Putin and his cronies. Yes, Putin is being won out, like the Ukrainians, and he wants to gather more resources to stay in power, because the whole purpose of this war is just for one thing: for him to stay in power. There is no imperial cause whatsoever. So in that sense, yes, Mr. Putin wants a pause. But what is very important to remember, that this war is to be continued in this or that form, because it is the means for him to stay in power in order to suppress all political life in Russia and be sure that he's not challenged.
So, Rasmus Nilsson, would you agree that Russia and Putin are two very distinct things? Many Ukrainians, for example, they post on social media saying that if Russians are not rising up against Putin, they are guilty of the same crimes. Would you say that this is a bit too harsh of a judgment? And do Russians really have any sort of means of resisting at this stage?
Yeah, I do think that sort of argument is problematic. I mean, look, I would like to see everybody resisting more than they do, but I'm also acknowledging the fact that I don't live in Russia and I don't have to fear suppression the same way that ordinary Russians do. Putin is definitely not the same as Russia. I completely agree. There are people in the country that support the war, absolutely. But the majority of people simply don't want to be part of it and want to try and preserve themselves and their families. I can completely sympathize with that. I will say, though, that there is a danger when you've had a regime like this in power for so long, when they have pushed this sort of nationalizing ideology that they have. Of course, over time, that can have a corrosive effect on society as a whole. That's not to criticize ordinary Russians, but it is just to be aware that the legacies, I mean, even if hypothetically Vladimir Putin, died today or disappeared from the stage today, the legacies of that regime can stay for a very, very long time. We've seen that in other cases, and we need to be aware of that. But no, I completely agree. Russia is not the same as Putin. Never has been, never shall be.
So, Sergei Yerofeyev, do you think that there is a silent majority in Russia whose voice is not really heard on an everyday basis? And what is the opinion on the war of that silent majority, if it does indeed exist in a verifiable way?
Janusz, this is a great question. It's become very common realization in the West among very sensible people that you cannot trust public opinion polls in Russia. This is mostly true, but there is one thing. Even state pollsters who are heavily censored by the Kremlin unavoidably betray the real processes which are undergoing. And it is also true that 18 out of 20 people refuse to answer the pollsters. and they are the silent majority. You are right. They are not responding because they disagree. They cannot do anything, but they disagree with the situation when they are asked by some dangerous creature called the state, because they see Poles as agents of the state, and they are trying to hide away. So this is all about trying to cope with the situation. In that sense, yes, it's a silent majority. How can it be measured? Even these polls, as I started with, betray the fact that the percentage, even of those who agreed to answer their questions, this percentage of those who are pro-peace is growing. And if the question is formulated in a more sort of cunning way, like if Mr. Putin decides to stop the war tomorrow, then the percentage of those who support this option is dramatically growing. It's at least doubling, going by 80% or more of those who dared to respond. So yes, this is true. This is absolute silent majority. This war was not expected by the Russian people. Nobody wanted this war except just maybe people you can count on one hand. Not even more than that. And there are warmongers, those who benefit from that, but this is a typical media strategy. They're selling themselves, first of all, not propaganda. And they're as much patriots, very often, those Z bloggers, as Putin is a Christian. You just showed a picture of Putin crossing himself and putting up a candle. So this should not betray that this is all a spectacle. The main thing behind all these rituals is to stay in power, because Putin is the dictator who fears his deposition from power more than any other dictator in contemporary world. He fancies a horrible torture and death and humiliation if he leaves his post.
So speaking of warmongers, the Russian media, and also a ritualistic approach to the media, Rasmus Nilsson, would you say that the current narrative from the Russian media is intended to hide something? They do a lot of chest puffing, but what actually lies beneath that?
Well, of course, I mean, this was indicated before as well, but the Russian state, to some extent, the Russian regime has an interest in continuing the war, or continuing focus on the war, continuing focus on international affairs, because then there's less focus on domestic affairs, there's less focus on the numerous failings in the Russian state project. I mean, the thing is, for the last many years, in fact, the Russian sort of state project, the welfare project that Mr. Putin promoted or said he was promoting, has not gone particularly well. Yes, in parts of Russia, people do live better than they did if you go decades back, but you have seen stagnating growth for many. Right now, some growth is being provided through military-industrial complex and so on and so forth, but it is not sustainable. Now, the only way this could become more sustainable would be if you got a more law-abiding state, if you got a more transparent state, if you got a state that was more focused on public welfare. And this is not in the interest of the regime or indeed of the immediate followers of that regime. So you divert attention, you look abroad, you talk about international status, you see you might end up soon having pictures of Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump shaking hands, showing each other respect, all that stuff. And you do that so there is less focus on the things that don't work at home. Now, you can't do that forever, but if you combine that with local suppression, some terror, as we see inside Russia, you can keep it going. And if you're Putin, you're thinking you might be able to keep it going for as long as you're alive, however long that may be. So those would be the main reasons why sort of a focus on foreign affairs would be desired by the regime. I still think there is some belief in an imperial destiny from the leadership. There is some sort of self-delusion that only they can save Russia, but it's mixed in with very venal, very banal interests in their own survival, but also in their own enrichment. And it has been from the beginning of the Putin tenure back in 2000.
Still, waging a war indefinitely is a grim prospect, not just for the Russian society, the economy, but also, first and foremost, for Ukraine and its allies. So, Sergei Yerofeyev, what do you think about the leverage which the West, in particular Donald Trump, can exercise right now? Are there any pressure points to be used against Putin which could actually work and bring him to the negotiating table?
I'm not talking about Putin's psychology. I'm talking about his social predisposition and his role as a mafia state leader. And in that sense, Putin is afraid of a number of people in the world. He is very wary of the Chinese leadership, and he's definitely much more afraid of Mr. Putin than President Biden. This is because Mr. Trump is a very specific sociocultural type himself. That type can be rooted sociologically in his social interactions as the type of showman and adventurist. This is the thing which cannot be easily deciphered by Mr. Putin. That's why he's afraid of Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump has certain means of pressuring Mr. Putin into more just peace. For that, not only he, but the Western establishment should understand the nature of Putin's regime and Putin's war better than they do now. There has been some slow process. You can see some indicators of moving to better understanding in the behavior of President Macron, for example. But in general, this process is extremely slow. So to speed up this process of understanding that Putin is not a politician and that he cannot really escalate. He cannot turn this war into nuclear war, not even in terms of minor tactical nuclear strike in Ukraine. This is totally out of question if you understand the nature of Putin. The only thing that Putin can do, he can retreat if he's properly pressured. So he should be dealt with from the position of power, but to realize that you, the Western leadership, are actually in the position of power. It's a very difficult job.
And very quickly, Rasmus Nilsson, what do you think can be used as an incentive in this regard? Economic pressure, more weapons to Ukraine, delegitimizing Putin in the same way that, say, Nicolas Maduro was delegitimized. What do you think would be the most effective?
I do think economic pressure has started showing some effect, so that definitely has to be kept up. But I think the main thing that has to be done is to keep showing unity in the Western world, America, Western Central Europe, and so on, Canada as well, Japan, South Korea. Keep showing unity in the lack of acceptance of what Russia has done. Keep showing that if Putin goes out and says to everybody, there's a new world order, we are right in, having a sphere of influence, we are right in attacking Ukraine, we are right in doing what we want. If the West, ideally with American support, if the West can go in and say, no, we do not accept that. No, we will continue this for as long as it takes. We will build up our military-industrial complex if that's what it takes. We will isolate you diplomatically as much as we can so you become completely dependent on China, which, quite rightly, as was said before, Russia does not want to become. If we can show that to Russia, that we are in this for the long term and we will, stay steadfast with Ukraine, then that matters. Symbolic steps in terms of saying our support, but also practical steps in terms of keeping up economic pressure and keeping up welfare, but also military support for Ukraine. That's what's needed for the next 5-10 more years.
Sergei Yerofeev and Rasmus Nilsson were our guests today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yana.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Germany's defense minister has said that he is open to the option of sending German soldiers to help secure a demilitarized zone in Ukraine. Such a zone has been floated as a possible part of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia.
Boris Pistorius said that sending German troops as part of a peacekeeping force would be a consideration if a ceasefire was reached between Russia and Ukraine. Such a ceasefire would also have to establish a buffer zone, according to the minister. He believes that since Germany is, quote, the largest NATO partner in Europe, it would have a role to play in this regard. He also emphasized the need for Germany to raise its defense spending to 3% of its GDP. Donald Trump has called for NATO allies to raise their military expenditure to 5% of their GDP. This idea has been strongly criticized, with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz even going so far as to call it too high. Berlin currently spends around 2% of its GDP on defense.
A recent survey by the British Chatham House Institute shows that most Belarusians are against Russia's war in Ukraine. Belarusian society has consistently opposed the invasion, despite Alexander Lukashenko's friendship with Vladimir Putin.
The poll was carried out on a sample of 833 Belarusians. According to it, 40% of Belarusians do not support Russia's involvement in the war in Ukraine. 32% fully or partially do, and 29% claimed it was difficult to say. Chatham House noted that some people could refuse or outright lie in their response for fear of their safety, as the Minsk regime is closely allied with Russia. The institute believes, however, that such cases were probably unlikely when it came to this particular survey. The high number of uncertain responses does indicate that several of the respondents may have been hesitant. Chatham House's survey since the start of the Russian invasion in 2022 show that Belarusian sentiments towards the war haven't shifted much over the last 3 years.
Nigeria has been admitted to the BRICS bloc as a partner state. The group has been presented by its founding members as an alternative to the various Western-led international institutions.
Brazil, one of the bloc's founders, informed about the decision to include Nigeria as a partner state. This means that the country is aligning itself with BRICS, but is not yet a full member state like Russia, China or India. In 2024, the bloc saw the biggest expansion since its establishment, with Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia and the United Arab Emirates joining. Saudi Arabia has been invited to join, while Turkey, Azerbaijan and Malaysia have officially applied to become BRICS members. Nigeria itself is the 9th partner country, alongside Belarus, Thailand and Kazakhstan among others. BRICS was founded in 2009 by Russia, China, Brazil and India as a counterweight to the group of 7. South Africa later joined the bloc in 2010.
Russians living in the country's southern city of Anapa have taken their traditional Epiphany dips. The problem is that the waters in that area have been affected by the recent Black Sea oil spill.
Despite concerns about toxic pollutions in the water by Russian authorities, many Russians from Anapa decided to observe the traditional Epiphany dips. On January 19th, it is customary for Russians all across the country to plunge into icy seas, rivers or lakes to mark the holiday. Celebrations went ahead in Anapa despite heavy fuel washing up on hundreds of kilometers of Russian shores around the Black Sea. The officials said that the water had been checked in advance, yet hours later the relevant task force said an overnight storm had brought new oil fragments to the coastline of Anapa. The oil leak was caused by 2 Russian oil tankers colliding in the Black Sea during a storm last month. Vladimir Putin has called the spill one of the most serious environment challenges that Russia has been faced with.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.